So maybe we should look like we're talking to each other
Well,
this
we
time.
could do that, which I think we are.
Yeah. So we'll see what the thumbnail looks like this time. Maybe we'll actually look like we're talking to each other and not just staring off
into the void of the camera thing. Hey, you get a haircut this week?
I did get a haircut this week. It looks like you did too.
I did. I needed it bad.
You look good, Dad.
You look good, son.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome, son.
So, welcome to RestorationCast. This week we're going to be talking about the Dead Sea. And as my dad just pointed out, we both got haircuts. I think you can probably tell if you watched last week's episode back-to-back with
hippies.
This week. My hair was very long. I was sitting in an environmental science class the other day, and I was sitting there, trying to take notes and write, and I realized at one point I couldn't see the PowerPoint slides because my hair was in my face.
You had a lot of hair hanging in front, yeah.
Yeah, so I got a haircut.
Got a haircut.
Yeah. The problem with haircuts at our house is Mom does it, and she does a great job, but she doesn't have a lot of time to give us haircuts.
No.
And so whenever I need a haircut, it doesn't really matter how long it is, because, it can be down to...
I've never seen that.
Samson. Down to here. I don't know. It can be really long, and you kind of just have to wait around to see, does Mom have a spare moment to get me a haircut?
Can she work us in for our haircut?
Yeah, and usually at the same time I have to wait and see, does Dad need a haircut?
That's good.
Because if we both need a haircut, then Mom's more inclined to have a spare moment.
That's true. She can double up. My seat's having a little trouble there. That's why I did that right there. A moment of dancing. Anyhow, you look good, Bub.
Well, thank you. This haircut thing has nothing to do with anything we're going to be talking about.
Not a bit.
We're not talking about Samson.
No.
We're talking about the Dead Sea.
Dead Sea.
I don't know.
Kind of a salty subject.
Yes. Yeah. I assume Samson knew what the Dead Sea was. He was probably in that area. So
no, that's a good point.
He might have gone there at one point.
Might have been familiar.
I don't know.
This kind of leads into where you're going to go, I think. But I think there's a lot of indication that prior to the events we're going to talk about, that was probably a very fertile place.
Yes.
At Samson's day, however, he's going to know it like we know it.
Yeah, probably something along those lines. Probably he didn't know it in quite the same way that we do.
Yeah.
Because a lot of that's happened over time. But anyway, we'll get into that.
We will.
Before we get started, I want to do a little content warning.
Ooh. We got to keep it PG, or what's up there?
We're probably not going to keep this one PG.
Oh, dear.
This episode will contain references to sexual assaults and other potentially triggering topics. So we're talking about Genesis 18 and 19, which, if you know anything about those passages, they're not the worst, most graphic passages in the Bible, but they are rather graphic, and so obviously we don't want to shy away from that, because we don't want to shy away from talking about any biblical subject, but at the same time I think we want to be clear and be understanding to the fact that these are triggering topics, and so if you don't want to listen to us talk about these things, then go ahead and you don't have to. I'm not going to make you stay.
I don't have to.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I preached this sermon at Boydsville, the congregation where I preach every Sunday. I preached it this morning at Boydsville, and because I had a captive audience, I tried to skirt around a lot of these issues. But in this particular case, if you don't want to listen,
we're not going to skirt.
We're not going to skirt. So, log off if you don't want to listen.
Or if you got children.
Yeah.
Be prepared to have to address some of this stuff, because we're dealing with the Bible history that's going on here.
Yeah, exactly. I don't plan to go into too much graphic detail or anything, but I will be talking about what it says, and so there's some stuff that it talks about.
It does talk about.
Anyway, we'll move on from that. So let's talk about the history of the Dead Sea.
History of the Dead Sea.
So whenever the Dead Sea is first mentioned in Scripture, this is Genesis 14:3, and we're going to look at it in just a second. But whenever it's first mentioned, it's referred to as the Valley of Siddim.
Siddim.
Which sounds a lot like Sodom. Maybe there's a connection. I don't know. I haven't really researched that aspect of it. But it's referenced as being the Valley of Siddim in Genesis 14:3. That's the first mention of it, and so we're going to look at that here in a second. The second mention, second two, I guess, would be Numbers chapter 34 and Deuteronomy 3. I lump those together because they're both kind of talking about the same thing. So they both are used as landmarks to describe the borders of Israel. That's kind of how the Dead Sea is mentioned most of the time in Scripture. It's not really that important. Not a lot of stuff happens around the Dead Sea area, or in the Dead Sea rather, because nothing can live in the Dead Sea, and so there's no fishermen or anything in that area. But it is often used as like this landmark to say that.
Not unlike the way you get directions in Arkansas. Go south on that dirt road till you get to the dead oak tree.
Yeah.
Turn left,
like
go to the big rock. Lifeless items that are just kind of hanging around there,
Yeah, exactly. And, this makes sense. Like, the Dead Sea is kind of this extraordinary location. And so, it makes sense everybody would recognize where this place is, what it is. And so they, would recognize this place as being, this landmark, I suppose that you would say. And so whenever they're, dividing out the tribes of Israel, whenever they're saying, this is the land that we're trying to conquer, mapping out those borders, they're using the Dead Sea as, kind of a reference point.
And when you look at the fact that it's a very obvious fingerprint of God, you kind of also get the feel as to why it would enter into biblical geography for us. God's going to reference a place where he visited that place once and it's never been the same since, kind of thing.
Yeah, and if you look at it on the map,
let's do that.
A little ahead of ourselves here, but you look at it on the map, basically what you do is, this is the biggest thing on the east side of Israel.
Oh,
right?
Yeah, good point.
And so, it makes a lot of sense that this would be this landmark, that you basically say Israel is right here in between the Dead Sea and the Great Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and that, this is where Israel is.
It's sandwiched between the two.
Yeah, exactly. So that it kind of makes sense that this would be a landmark.
Sure.
For those reasons. The other thing about the Dead Sea is this is the place where, or one of the places where David fled whenever he was running from Saul. He goes. He doesn't just like go to the Dead Sea. Obviously, he goes to a town that's kind of on the edge of the Dead Sea, which I knew the name. En-Gedi, that's what it is.
En-Gedi.
He goes to En-Gedi, which is this town that's kind of on the edge of the Dead Sea, and it's kind of an oasis, basically. So, that's the reason the town would be built there, and then David flees there, and so that's basically your one other historical connection to the Dead Sea. There's, again, not a lot of history that goes on with this place in particular, but it's there.
Speaking of David, and I don't know the answer to this one, but I know I've been there. There's a lot of caves in that area. We know that David did a whole lot of caving. What do you call it? Spelunking. He spent some time in caves. Did that have any attraction to... he's running. He's on the run from Saul, so he's trying to hide. I would think that'd be a good place to go.
And yeah, I don't know that had anything to do with it, but it's a theory.
It's a theory. That's what I'm here for. They call me color commentary, just for theories. Let's go back to facts.
All right. The last two things here. One is that the Dead Sea is kind of restored. I guess you would call it restored. I don't know that it ever was, fertile or whatever you call it to begin with. So I don't know that restored is really the right word, but Ezekiel has this vision where God fixes the Dead Sea, basically.
Okay.
We're going to look at that one too because it's basically the last mention of the Dead Sea. You could kind of argue that it's not because Joel mentions it. So, like, in the order our books of the Bible are, it's not the last mention, but chronologically it is the last mention. In the Hebrew Bible, I think it's also mentioned in 1st or 2nd Chronicles, so it's not the last mention in the Hebrew Bible either. But I want it to be the last mention because I think it's interesting, and so
let's make it the last.
I decided to say that it's the last one.
I'm with you on this whole thing, buddy.
Yeah, I think chronologically.
We're going to go with that one.
So, anyway, and then the last thing is I can't talk about the Dead Sea without mentioning the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Well, I would think not.
So, the Dead Sea Scrolls, as pictured here, are these, I guess they're papyrus scrolls that were found in a cave, as you mentioned, in like these clay pots near the Dead Sea area.
As I understand the story, are you going to tell the story? How that happened? When we get there?
I was going to mention some of it.
Oh, well, I don't want to get ahead of you, man. You.
I was just going to say that there's this Bedouin shepherd.
That's what I was going to say.
Goes in and, if I remember the story correctly, I think he breaks one of the pots on accident or something along those lines and discovers this papyrus scroll. And so he's kind of investigating. And it leads to this major archaeological discovery. Probably the biggest one within the last century.
Of modern history, yeah.
Yeah.
This is a big deal to your grandfather in his book that he wrote on evidences. And you can see why, because a lot of what's going to happen with these fragments is going to actually give confirmation to the consistency of Scripture.
Yeah.
And so we, again, have another tool to share with individuals who are doubting God and saying, no, he guards his word.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're ever researching textual criticism or archaeology and you're reading books that have come out since the 90s, probably you're going to know about this topic. You're going to know about the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's just, it's so important that it's kind of just become kind of commonplace, honestly, that, any Bible scholars are going to know what the Dead Sea Scrolls are, at least tangentially, I imagine. Whereas, lots of other archaeological discoveries, they're, a little bit more, I don't know, they're not as big, I guess, or...
Yeah, and you even question sometimes their legitimacy because, sometimes you feel like the Christian world is desperate for a confirmation, and so they come up with whatever. But this one's kind of hard to deny. The Essenes that were probably down, are you going to talk about them a little bit? No? Well, the Essenes were probably down in that area. John the Baptist may have been an Essene. Mm-hmm. They did a lot of scribe work, that kind of thing. So a lot of folks believe that these scrolls were actually produced by that group, and then when the Romans or whoever came in to conquer, they hid them in these caves.
Yeah.
And, I talk about a God thing. It's a very dry region, maybe one of the few places on earth where something like this would actually survive the years until they're discovered, like you say, by this shepherd who, I'm told, had a sheep that ran back and he threw a rock back in there, plunk years, whatever, and he finds these things. Like you say, one of the biggest discoveries, certainly of modern history, as far as biblical archaeology is concerned.
Yeah, exactly. So this is, obviously this very important discovery that we have, and it has really nothing to do with the Dead Sea, except the fact that that's the area where it was discovered, and so that's the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think that's a good summary of the topic. Obviously, there's more things that could be said about that, but I don't know them, so I'm not going to say them. All right, so the first mention of the Dead Sea in Scripture. Genesis 14, verses 1 through 3. I guess if you're here, you can read it.
Well, Genesis 14, 1 through 3, that's got a bunch of names in it. Are you sure you want me to read that? Here we go. At this time, Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim. Now I know why you wanted me to read it. Anyhow, these guys, they went to war against Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Adoma, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zor. All these latter kings joined forces in the valley of Siddim, the Salt Sea. That's what it's got in brackets for me.
Yeah, that's what it says here as well. This is ESV. I don't know what you're.
I was reading NIV. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Anyway, so this obviously it's not a big deal, I guess. This one mention of the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea. Also, by the way, I probably should have mentioned this, but the name the Dead Sea is never actually used in Scripture. Whenever we talk about the Dead Sea, if we look it up in Scripture, it's going to be called either the Salt Sea, or sometimes it's called the East Sea, because it's on the east side.
Right, eastern side.
So it's never actually referred to as being the Dead Sea, but that's the name that we have for it today, so that's how we talk about it. So it talks about the Salt Sea, and the thing that's interesting in this story, this is, by the way, the story leading up to what we talked about. I think we talked about it last week with Abraham going in and rescuing Lot,
Melchizedek, and all that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This is the lead up to that story. And so, these kings are all gathering to make war, and they gather in this place called the Valley of Siddim, which it says is the Salt Sea, which is interesting because he pretty clearly says that they're gathering in a valley, and then he says that valley is the sea, which I don't know about the rest of you guys, but I've never seen an army gather to fight on the sea unless they're boats,
right,
that kind of thing. Obviously, it happens, but it doesn't seem to be the indication here. It seems like these are land troops that are going down to this valley to meet up to fight.
Why would you reference valley?
Yeah, exactly.
If you're a Navy gathering.
Yeah, exactly. And so it seems to be the indication that in Genesis 14, and probably throughout this whole time period, the Valley of Siddim, the Salt Sea, actually isn't a sea.
Yeah, good point.
This landmark here doesn't exist. It's just a valley. And so this is the place where they go.
Are you going to reference verse 10?
I wasn't planning to. What is verse 10?
Well, I just found it interesting as I was reading on while you were talking there. Very valuable material, by the way, what you were saying. I was paying attention.
Oh, thank you.
It says in verse 10, now the Valley of Siddim, that's our valley, was full of tar pits. Yeah. So, you've got this reference to a land mass or a land condition. And it's also, I made the point earlier that they have indications that maybe it was a fertile area prior to. Well, Genesis 14 is pretty early in history. Maybe this land area was always somewhat tragic, or had the trappings of the tar pits and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So definitely, I think that tar pit thing kind of proves that this is land, not the sea. Particularly because what it's going to say is the reason it mentions the tar pits is they're running away, and some of them fall into the tar pits. I don't think you can do that on a boat.
I don't think so.
So, definitely we have this idea that this is a valley. This is this is land. It's not the sea.
So prior to this body of water, at least that large, was probably not existent.
Yeah, theoretically. I guess it could be that there's a valley in that area that they're gathering in, that it's not actually saying this is the Salt Sea, but
right.
I think that's the idea that he's trying to get at, is that this is where the Salt Sea is going to eventually be.
Good point.
And right now it's just a valley.
Yeah, very good point.
So it's kind of an interesting fact, I guess, about the Dead Sea is I mentioned earlier that probably during the time of Samson, it wasn't exactly like it is now. And the reason for that is because what actually happens with the Salt Sea is the water that's flowing down from the Sea of Galilee, down the Jordan River, into the Dead Sea is high in salt content. So this is salt water that's flowing down. And then what happens is it gets to the Dead Sea and it doesn't have anywhere to go. And so it evaporates, and whenever salt water evaporates, the salt stays behind. And so basically what's happening is the salt is staying, but you're not getting enough water to replenish the water content as compared to the salt. And so over time, it just gets more and more salty, the water, which obviously makes sense. That's why it's called the Salt Sea.
Yeah.
That it's because this is where all the salt goes. But you kind of get this idea that this isn't, probably I should have mentioned this later on, but this isn't something that just like happens in a flash. I think that's how we typically think of the Dead Sea, is that like at one point it was just like this lake or something, and then eventually, or all of a sudden it becomes salty. That's not really how it happened. Really, it was more like over time it becomes saltier, probably. So that's the first mention. The last mention, is Ezekiel 47, 8 through 10. It says, "And she said to me, this water flows toward the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah and enters the sea." I probably should mention the context.
Okay.
So Ezekiel 47, he's having this vision of this stream that's coming out of the temple. All right. So this pure water is flowing out of the temple, and he follows the stream basically, and it gets deeper and deeper until the point whenever he can't. It's just too big that he couldn't like swim across this stream anymore. And the stream flows from Jerusalem into the sea. Yes, the Dead Sea, the Salt Sea. So it says it enters the sea, and it's got several like landmarks, other than just the fact that it says it goes east. It has several landmarks to back up the fact that this is the Dead Sea that it's talking about. But it says it enters the sea, and when the water flows into the sea, the water will become fresh, and wherever the river goes, every living creature that swarms will live, and there will be very many fish. For this water goes there, that the waters of the sea may become fresh, so everything will live where the river goes. Fishermen will stand beside the sea, from En-gedi, which is...
we've heard of that one.
To Eneglaim, or whatever. It will be a place for the spreading of nets. Its fish will be of very many kinds, like the fish of the Great Sea.
Wow.
So, essentially, you have this story with kind of the application of God restores everything, right? Yeah. Or he can restore anything, probably is a better application to that. And so you have the story of this Dead Sea, this place that seems to be beyond restoration.
Right.
That this is beyond any hope of anything. And yet, God essentially says that I'm going to have this river that flows out of my presence.
Yes.
Out of the temple. We talked about that last week. So it flows out of the temple, and it goes into the Dead Sea, and wherever this water goes, it restores all of the place. It restores everything. And so there's no fish that are able to live in the Dead Sea at this point. Nothing can live there because of how much salt there is. And yet God says, but I'm going to send this river, and it's going to, its waters will be fresh and will restore the Dead Sea. And then all kinds of fish will be living there.
And I can attribute, by the way, being that I've gone there, it's dead. I mean, it's not just the water's dead. Everywhere around, everywhere you look is dead, okay? Mm-hmm. And your grandpa actually went for a swim while we were there. I chose not to do that, but he'll tell you the stories about it. You just float on top of it. There's so much salt in it. It's just a dead place. And if God and his power, even if it's prophetic in nature, symbolic in nature, whatever it may be, if he is going to restore something of that nature, given what I saw, that's going to be quite an act of God.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the bottom line point of this prophetic vision of Ezekiel.
Yeah, and so you kind of say, what's the application of this? Obviously, during Ezekiel's time, God did not restore the Dead Sea,
right?
Because it's still dead. But you kind of ask yourself, like, what is the point of this message? Is God actually going to restore the Dead Sea? And maybe, I don't know, that could be the answer. Maybe he will restore the Dead Sea. I think probably it's meant to be taken in a more general sense, though, right? That God is saying that he's going to restore his people, he's going to restore Israel, he's going to restore everything. And so, at the end of time, we have this moment whenever God comes. We talk about this every week, but the dwelling place of God is with man.
Amen.
And it seems like the idea of this is God has cleansed the world, he's destroyed it with this cleansing fire, and now he's coming to restore everything, to fix everything back to the way it was in the Garden of Eden. And so that's basically what God does here, is he makes the Dead Sea alive and perfect again.
Wow.
All right, so that's the first and last mention of the Dead Sea and a little bit of the history of the Dead Sea. But the passage that we really want to talk about, that we did our little disclaimer about, is Genesis chapters 18 and 19.
So this part may not be PG.
Yeah, so if you have been with us this long and you still don't want to hear all of the triggering things that the Bible has to say, this is probably a good moment for you to to tune out.
Pretty good. Triggering. Put your hands over your kids' ears. Here we go.
All right, so first I want to start with this question of whom does God save? I put whom because I think it's grammatically correct, but I'm not actually sure.
I'm not a grammatically correct guy. I would probably say, who does God save? But I'm probably not right.
Yeah, who sounds right to me.
It does.
But
Please write in and tell us whether he's right or wrong. Vote for me.
Yeah, so anyway, whom does God save? Maybe I'm just trying to sound pretentious. I'm not sure. But as we go through, this is the question that I want you guys to be asking yourselves. So regardless of whether you say who or whom, this is the question that we're going to be trying to cover with this study of these two chapters. So really not two chapters. It's really the end of 18 and most of 19.
Okay.
So Genesis 18 verses 22 through 23. Jumping right in here. It says, so the men turned from there and went toward Sodom. I probably should have added a little extra to this, actually, because right before this, God's talking to these angels that he has with him, and he basically says, should I tell Abraham that I'm going to destroy Sodom? And then this is what happens.
And right prior to that, Abraham and God have been dickering about whether or not they should be saved. Or does that come here in the midst?
This is when they dicker.
Oh, this is when they dicker. That's why I'm with him, not him with me. Go, man.
Yeah, so anyway, so the men turned from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And the Lord said, if I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Abraham answered and said, behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And he said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. Again he spoke to him and said, suppose 40 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 40 I will not do it. Then he said, oh, let the Lord not be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there. He answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there.
At this particular point, I would have been a little frustrated if I were God.
Yeah, actually, that's kind of an interesting thing you bring up there, which is Abraham seems to think that God is mad at him. He keeps apologizing all over himself, don't be angry with me, but I'm going to ask again.
Yeah.
But it never actually indicates that God is frustrated. I guess Abraham thinking God is kind of an indication, but it never says God became angry with Abraham and Abraham kept going. It's just Abraham seems to think he's overstepping his bounds here.
Big application. I need to be more like God.
Yeah, definitely. And probably, and in the same respect, whenever we think we're asking too much of God, most of the time we're not.
Yeah, God can handle it.
Yeah, exactly.
Talk
to God. He answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. He said, Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. He answered, For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it. Then he said, let not the Lord be angry. I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there. He answered, For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place.
And when you consider how big Sodom probably was, Abraham starts low. 50,
probably.
That's the, and he keeps backing God down all the way to 10. And you gotta think that even Abraham is concerned that we're not gonna get the 10.
Yeah, Abraham's. It's a little kind of odd that you kind of wonder, why is Abraham undertaking to do this at all?
Yeah.
I think in my mind, I would ask God to do what he does. I would say, my nephew Lot is living in that town.
Yeah,
so could you rescue Lot?
Right.
I don't really care about the rest of the inhabitants of this town, but Abraham doesn't for some reason, even though he apparently thinks that they're mostly not righteous.
If he starts with 50, you can't think there's too many.
Yeah, and he keeps working down, because I think Abraham really here is doubting himself. Right?
I agree.
That he starts with 50, and he's like, there's 50 righteous people, and then he's like, well, but I mean, there might not be 50, so what if there's only 45?
Yeah.
Say there's only 10.
I was doing the math earlier too. If you ever think that if you got, let's just say, okay, he's figuring in his head, I got to get Lot and his folks out of there.
Mm-hmm.
We got Lot, Mrs. Lot, 2 daughters, and 2 husbands.
Mm-hmm.
We're only at 6.
Yeah.
But he doesn't get that far. He gets down to 10, hoping we can maybe find 4 more.
Yeah, that's the odd thing, is I feel like if I had been Abraham, I would have been like, so say you had 3 righteous people in Sodom.
Yeah.
Would you destroy it then? Because I'm pretty sure there's at least 3.
I can get 3.
Anyway, so Abraham does this dickering, as you called it, with God. And into the story, obviously, we know there's not 10 righteous people in Sodom. And so Sodom gets destroyed. But what seems to be the implication of this story in relation to our question of who or whom does God save is what we have up here at the top of the screen. God saves the righteous.
Amen.
Right? And so Abraham is dickering with God. He's bartering, asking God, are you going to save these people? And specifically what Abraham says is, are you going to destroy all of these righteous people just for the sake of destroying the wicked? Are you not going to rescue the righteous people? Right?
Can I make a point real quick? That's something your grandpa taught me years ago, and I think it really does play into end times thought, and that is, when you look at this particular story, you begin to see how God is willing to go way down to the minimum before he brings destruction. And I think that there's an application for you and I. I had a good friend of mine just today, this is being recorded on a Sunday, and he was telling me after we had worship together, he was telling me, he said, I want to be part of the remnant. Me too. Remnant is always very, very small. And so we ask ourselves with regards to end times, when's the Lord coming back? When's he going to be finally done with this? When are we going to repeat the Noah scenario so that he decides he's got to... And I think that we're getting close. I think that you can judge some of that by the patience of God. He wants to get to a place where we are, have had every opportunity, if you will.
Yeah. It's interesting comparing this story to the story of Noah. That in this story, God agrees that he won't destroy these 2 cities if he finds 10 righteous people in them. In the story of Noah, obviously that's not the same thing exactly, because he never says, I'm not going to destroy the world. In fact, he does destroy the world. But it seems to be the implication that Noah is actually the only righteous person on earth at the point whenever God destroys the world.
Right.
And so, you get Sodom and Gomorrah. It seems like Lot's really the only righteous person in Sodom. Noah's the only righteous person on earth whenever it's destroyed during the flood. And so it seems like God kind of is even more patient than I think we would expect him to be.
Good point.
Right? Whenever I say remnant, I'm typically thinking kind of not of a large group of people, but a comparatively small group of people. Like if I'm talking about a whole country, I'm thinking like a couple thousands, maybe even like a whole town, like tens of thousands of people would be the remnant.
Right.
Whereas God seems to think of the remnant as being like one.
Yeah. That's a very good point, because like you say, with Noah, there's no real indication that Mrs. Noah and the rest of them were all that great. I mean, we just don't know.
Yeah.
But certainly we know with this one, we know Mrs. Lot wasn't all that great, and we certainly know his two daughters weren't all that great.
Yeah, exactly. And so, again, going back to our application, or the answer to our question here, God saves the righteous, right? And so Abraham basically is bargaining with God on this premise.
Yeah,
of
good point.
God is going to rescue righteous people. And so he says, are you going to destroy the whole city? Are you going to sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Abraham knows that God won't destroy the righteous. And so that's where he starts his debate, basically.
And one last thing about that, and it sounds to me like his point is, no, I will not sweep away the righteous with the wicked. And he doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
But even in the same process, he removes some who aren't all that righteous.
Yeah.
Because of, evidently, the righteousness of Lot.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, more in point, because of the righteousness of Abraham.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Sorry, Dad. Or, I'm the dad. He's the son. Sorry, son.
That's okay. So, continuing on with that point, starting in chapter 19 now, so
19
next
and 1.
verse, 19 verses 1 through 3. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way." They said, "No, we'll spend the night in the town square." But he pressed them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And she made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. So basically, what I think is happening in this portion of the story is we're trying to contrast Lot with the rest of Sodom, right? Yeah. So we've had this debate between God and Abraham of, are you going to destroy the righteous along with the wicked? And now we get this moment whenever we basically demonstrate who this righteous person is we're talking about. Like, if we find 10 righteous people in Sodom, they're all going to be Lot, but times 10, right?
Yeah.
But we're doing this to contrast Lot with the men of Sodom, and so with that we go to Ezekiel chapter 16, and we got a picture there for you, Dad.
Thank you. I like pictures.
Yeah, it looks a lot more high
Salty.
resolution on my iPad. But yeah, so we've got this picture. This is of the Dead Sea. And there's a lot of salt there. Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Kind of salty.
Kind of, yeah. So we go to Ezekiel chapter 16, and this talks about what it is going to say. This is the where does it say it actually? This is the guilt of Sodom. It's right there at the beginning.
It's right at the beginning.
It's going to say this is the guilt of Sodom. So whenever we talk about this idea of what is the sin of Sodom, there's a lot of debate along that line. And this is probably one of the passages that people will use to say that the sin of Sodom isn't homosexuality. I don't know that we should actually cover that.
We've already given them the rating.
We have given them the rating. Okay, so here's my 2 cents.
Go ahead.
I think that there can be more than one sin of Sodom.
Absolutely.
And so I think while it is definitely... I think that sometimes we would harp. I don't know about harping too much on homosexuality, but we would point to Sodom and Gomorrah and say, this is the story that says it's wrong to be homosexual. And I would say there's lots of places you can go in Scripture.
Absolutely.
As a matter of fact, Grandpa was telling us this just this morning during home church talking, because we mentioned this story. But he was talking about a lady that got up and gave some kind of presentation at I don't even know what it was that you guys went to.
Something about, it was kind of a morals, return to morals kind of a lecture.
Yeah, it was a political type thing. But anyway, basically when she did, and she went through and just read all of the different passages in Scripture that talk about homosexuality. And whenever you do that, you discover that it's wrong without having to go Sodom and Gomorrah. So I think sometimes we do kind of a disservice to Sodom and Gomorrah by saying, like, the sin of Sodom is sodomy. It's homosexuality. There's a lot more that's going on in this story.
Definitely.
And so, is homosexuality wrong? Absolutely. I definitely believe that. But at the same time, this probably isn't the story that I would go to.
And don't you think that, like you said, we kind of do it a disservice, because in the process of zoning in on homosexuality, we're going to neglect all the stuff you're fixing to say here that is also part of this process. And so the conditions that's going to bring a culture down is probably not going to zero in on just one little thing. They're righteous and everything else, but that one little thing. It's going to be a lifestyle of things that are anti-God.
Yeah, and I think this passage is really interesting whenever we talk about this story, because I think what we do a lot of the time is, obviously homosexuality is a very relevant topic in our day, and yet I feel like this kind of has become one of the big sins,
Right.
You can kind of say, well, I might not be the best Christian ever, but at least I'm not a homosexual.
Yeah.
And I think we do people a disservice by doing that, right? Like that's not a great way to view other people.
Well, we let ourselves off the hook by making those kind of excuses that back in the day I used to say, well, I may not be the greatest Christian, but I don't beat my wife.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, what kind of standard is that?
Yeah, exactly. And so what's interesting about this passage is Ezekiel's going to go in and he's going to say, this is the sin of Sodom. And he uses something that I think applies to just about everybody that's listening to this video. Like anybody who ever lived except for Jesus probably struggles with this particular problem. So he says, behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy.
Wow.
They were haughty and did an abomination before me, so I removed them when I saw it.
Wow.
So obviously we have this idea of they had excess of food and prosperous ease. So that's not everybody, but I think pretty much everybody has struggled with pride at some point, right? And so whenever you look at that, I think you have to be convicted, right?
Sure.
That it's easy for me to say I'm not a homosexual, and so I'm not guilty of the sin of Sodom. At least I'm not going to be wiped off the face of the planet, because I'm not one of those people. But at the same time, I am one of those people, right?
Yeah.
I have pride. I certainly have excess of food and prosperous ease. And so how often, talking to this American audience, how often do we have this excess of food and ease, and we don't aid the poor and needy?
Oh, yeah.
Right? How often are we guilty of the sin of Sodom?
You don't want to unleash me on that one, do you?
No, I probably don't.
Be proud to move on.
But, we have this idea, and I think this passage is very relevant to all of us. And I think the reason he says this, right, I think if Ezekiel was living in Israel and he looks around and he says, all of these people are homosexual, he probably would have said that's the sin of Sodom. I think the point is that Sodom has a lot of problems.
Yes.
Probably most of the problems that you can have. And so Ezekiel says, this is the sin of Sodom because this is the problem that Israel's struggling with, right? And it just so happens to be something that we're struggling with today.
And I think to make your point even stronger, from the Restoration School Biblical Study standpoint, what is the one thing we always say? Let the Bible interpret the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what does God say was the sin of Sodom? We just saw it.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't exclude homosexuality. And certainly he also is the author of our passage, Genesis chapter 19, where we're going to talk about homosexuality. So it certainly plays in.
Yeah.
But let's not underappreciate what God himself specifically highlights with regards to the sin of Sodom.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing is what Ezekiel describes here. You've heard people probably say that the sin of Sodom wasn't homosexuality; it was it was lack of hospitality, which I think is partially true. It's not homosexuality, but I think there is some truth to that. That there is certainly this sin in the fact that the people of Sodom are not being hospitable to these two men that enter the city. And so whenever we read about the story of Lot, what we discover is that Lot is doing exactly the thing that the men of Sodom are not willing to do.
Yeah.
Right? They are living in excess of food and prosperous ease, and they're not willing to aid the poor and needy. They're not being hospitable, but Lot is.
Yes.
Right? And so Lot becomes this figure, this example of righteousness to these people because he's doing the thing that they're not willing to do. So I say all that to say, basically, Lot contrasts the people of Sodom.
Well, that's another powerful picture.
Yeah.
Salt. What would you call those?
Mounds, I
salt,
guess.
Not pillars? Could we call them pillars of salt?
I think we could.
Let's do it.
So we got another picture here of these pillars of salt. The other reason we know that Lot is a righteous person is because, again, letting the Bible interpret the Bible, the New Testament says he is.
And up to this point, would you have said that? I mean, if you just give me 18 and 19 of Genesis, I'm going to say, boy, it was nice of him to try to defend those guys and whatever. But at one point, he seems to offer up his daughters. At another point, we've got him begging not to have to leave. Mm-hmm. On and on you go with that. And so, honestly, if you hadn't given me the 2 Peter passage, I might have said to you, I don't know that I see a lot of righteousness here.
Yeah, I think the 2 Peter passage is actually a really hard passage to wrap your mind around.
Yeah.
Because Peter talks about Lot in such glowing terms.
I know.
Right? Like, it doesn't really seem to track with this story. And yet, I think sometimes we have to... we'll get into it.
Okay.
So 2 Peter 2, 6 through 9... If by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials, and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment. So,
it is pretty glowing.
It is like he mentions he calls Lot righteous 3 times. In what is this even 2 sentences? No, this is one really long sentence, and he calls Lot righteous 3 times. He says righteous Lot. He says this righteous man. He says he's tormenting his righteous soul. Like these are glowing terms. He doesn't have a great vocabulary, but these are glowing terms, right? Apparently Peter's really impressed with Lot.
Yeah.
And I think there's also an application in this of why he says that Lot is righteous. He says Lot is righteous because that righteous man lived among them day after day, and he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what it means to be righteous.
Good.
Right?
Good.
So we look in the Beatitudes, and Jesus will say, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And we kind of say, what does that mean? What does it mean to mourn? Does it mean, blessed are those who love people that have died? Is that what it means to mourn? That's how we typically refer to it. What is this about? And I think part of it is he's saying, blessed are those people that see the sin of the world. They see the unrighteous deeds of those around them. They see their own unrighteous deeds, and they are mourning those things. And they are tormenting in their righteous souls.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I think that kind of becomes a question for us, is if we're going to be as righteous as Lot is, and I don't think any of us would say Lot's we wouldn't describe him as well as Peter does. So if we're going to be as righteous as Lot, who's probably not even that high of a bar, then what we need to do is we need to be the kinds of people who, whenever we see sin, we mourn over it.
Wow. Well, that's powerful. Your grandpa just this morning, he was making that point about how when you pedal backwards and Lot is given the choice of whether he's going to take the mountains or going to take the valleys. He chooses the valley. And Grandpa made the point, he said, and he pitches his tent towards Sodom, meaning that he's going that direction. He sees the bright lights of the big city. Mm-hmm. So you kind of get this impression about Lot that from the beginning, he kind of makes a selfish choice about, I want the fertile valley. Mm-hmm. He then pitches his tent towards Sodom. Next thing you know, we find him sitting in the city gates, etc. You got this point, this idea in your mind that this guy's really making a lot of compromises with the world, which I think he was. Mm-hmm. I think that's why his daughters learned what they did in the city, etc. But that doesn't mean he doesn't have a conscience. And it doesn't mean that it wasn't beating him up. This is a young man who grew up in the household of Abraham. Mm-hmm. And so, he's got a conscience, and that righteous conscience is tormenting him when he sees all that's going on within the city. And perhaps he himself thought to himself, I can turn this around. I can make a difference if I stay here within the city with these people.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that kind of is a call to all of us, that whenever we see people doing unrighteous things around us, whenever we see ourselves doing unrighteous things, that it behooves us to be like Lot and to mourn those things.
Yes.
To be actually upset about the fact that people are doing unrighteous things. I think a lot of the time we kind of could care less.
Yeah.
We see other people doing these things and we kind of just say, well, you do you, that kind of thing. I don't think that necessarily we should be going around stopping people, I can't possibly let you commit this sin because, I think people ought to have free will. And yet at the same time, I think we need to be these kinds of people that are mourning the mistakes of other people.
How much of that do you see in the church today?
Not a lot.
We have a lot of our traditional religious activities that we go through. Mm-hmm. Maybe the high point I see just in the modern church today is, Celebrate Recovery, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I think that that's a phenomenal program. But whenever you really look at the church and what the church does, a typical Christian, especially in America today, I don't see a lot of grieving. I think that there's our tendency to want to be religiously correct. Mm-hmm. Especially here in the buckle of the Bible Belt, most of our friends are going to church, and so we want to be religiously correct. So we go to church. Yeah. But as far as really hurting for the lost, suffering for the lost, I'm not sure that I see a lot of that in the church today. And just to kind of hit my, point that I always talk, it seems like the shepherds, the elders of our churches, ought to be leading that charge. Mm-hmm. If anybody ought to be weeping, having regular prayer meetings, on their knees, talking about it with tears in their eyes, it ought to be our elders.
Yeah. I mean, you look at Ezra and Nehemiah. Mm. So these are probably better examples of people that you should follow than Lot is. But you look at Ezra and Nehemiah, and Ezra comes in and he discovers that the children of Israel have married all of these foreign women, basically. And what's the first thing he does? He weeps. He tears his clothes. He starts tearing hair out of his head and his beard, which basically shows he's ashamed of this. And whenever he prays, he doesn't pray to God, these people are so terrible, I wish you would smite them, or, fix this problem. He actually, he goes to God and says, we've messed up. All of us. He mourns this mistake, even though he's not the one that made it. He's in mourning. The same thing happens with Nehemiah. That whenever he discovers that the walls of Jerusalem haven't been restored yet, obviously, he goes and he fixes it. But also, he like goes into this immediate state of mourning. That's the reason the king sends him, is because he recognizes that Nehemiah is upset about something, and so he says, you can go and fix the walls.
Yeah, I see some of these same shepherds, these elders. I've sat beside them at basketball games, and they just go wild because of some, a 3-pointer was hit at the end of the game and we win, and they can get so emotional about things that don't count. And then when it comes to things such as this, some of my flock is wandering away. I've got people within my assembly who are living together, not being married. It goes unchallenged. It goes unwept over, if that's even a right sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And I just find us in the church today, sadly, not even living up to the conditions of Lot and his thoughts about Sodom.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's a challenge for all of us, is this idea of mourning over.
Yeah, I need to do more of it.
The sins.
I publicly acknowledge I do not weep as much. I'm doing more of it in my older age. I spend a lot of time thinking, weeping over situations, but I, as a young man, certainly didn't, and I don't do it nearly enough.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that's the righteous. We see that God rescues righteous people, but it's interesting. We're running out of time really quick. I have a lot more material, so it's interesting. The 2 Peter passage that he basically restates that thesis, right? That God rescues the righteous, but he says, "We know then that the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials," and then he says something else. He says, "And he knows how to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment." So what we have is this idea, not just that God rescues the righteous, but he also destroys the wicked.
Yes.
And so this is the part of the show that we've been talking about. So you could watch the whole first hour of this episode and
first 56 minutes.
And we never actually talk about the thing that I said we were going to talk about, the advisory. Now we're going to get into it.
Okay,
so Genesis chapter 19, verses 4 through 11. "But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old," whenever it says they lay down, it means the angels. Right? So Lot's taken them into the house, they've eaten bread, and they're about to go to bed. And then the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them." I think the NIV says have sex with them. So it's a little more explicit. That, may know them kind of sounds like maybe like, bring them out here so I can, give them a nice firm handshake and introduce myself. Like, that's not what he's talking about.
Bring them out to us so that we may have sex with them is what the NIV.
Yeah, which is a little more clear of a translation. I don't know if it's actually better, but I know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they said, "Stand back." And they said, This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. So it's interesting, they basically say, "Don't judge me."
Don't judge me, but I'm judging you.
And then they say, we're gonna beat you up now.
Yeah.
Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and drew near to break the door down. But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out, groping for the door.
Wow.
Which is, it's a crazy description. Like that's probably one of the most disturbing images that I have, like, living in my head rent free. Right? Yeah. Like this is a terrible idea that they're blind and yet they're still trying to. They're trying to rape these guys, right?
Right.
Which is the reason I would say that there's a lot more going on in Sodom than homosexuality, right?
Sure.
Certainly we have the Ezekiel passage, but then these guys, yes, they're homosexual. They're also trying to have an orgy. They're also trying to rape these two guys that are in the city. So there's your content warning.
Yeah.
And so, there's a lot more going on to this story. And whenever we get to the story of Lot's daughters, which we're not actually going to read, but whenever we get to that story, it's interesting what they learn from the town of Sodom isn't to be homosexuals, but they do become rapists.
Good point.
Right? And so there's a lot more that's going on with this story than just the fact that these men are homosexuals.
So you raise your children in a public education scenario where they're going to learn these values, and it's going to eventually show up.
Yeah, and so we recognize how wicked these men are.
Very
right?
wicked.
And so because of that, God, he goes and he destroys Sodom.
And, not to belabor the point, but you go back in your passage and it says every man in Sodom is beaten on the door.
Yeah.
They're all trying to get in there. This is, forgive, but we've already given you the disclaimer. They're fresh meat. Mm-hmm. These are men who have not been circled around the process within Sodom. We've all done it with all the other guys, but I've never done it with that guy.
Yeah. Yeah, that seems to be kind of the implication, which, again, it's disturbing, right? Like this is a terrible story that goes way beyond just the idea that these guys are homosexuals, that this is way more than just that. These guys, they're just awful. Like this is probably one of the worst stories in the Bible. I think the Judges version of this is worse.
It's pretty bad,
but it's basically the same story, except the ending isn't quite as good. Lot gets away, and the angels do. But anyway, so we're not going to read Judges because
we've already exceeded our PG limit on this one.
That's where I draw the line.
Stay right here with this one.
So God, he does destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. So he destroys the wicked, just like my thesis statement said he would. And so we got this picture here. That's a rock formation on Mount Sodom, overlooking the Dead Sea, called Lot's wife.
There she is, guys.
It's probably not actually her, wife, but I assume that some people think that that's Lot's wife.
Probably do.
The other thing, the reason we mentioned...
She wasn't very attractive.
Not if she looked like that.
Stone face and everything. Go ahead. Sorry.
The reason I mentioned earlier this idea of the reason that the Dead Sea is so salty is because I think there's probably a lot of people that think that this catastrophe is the reason that the Dead Sea is dead. And I would argue that probably it's not that this is the reason the Dead Sea is dead. We would say, well, Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt, so obviously that's why the Dead Sea is so salty. That's probably has nothing to do with it. Probably what's more likely is the Dead Sea doesn't exist. There is no body of water here until this story happens. And now it's created like this fissure or something, a place for the water to go. And so that it creates the Dead Sea, it doesn't kill it.
And as you've already shown us earlier, it's already a place that's full of mud pits. Mm-hmm. So it's already somewhat unattractive prior to this event.
Yeah, and it kind of makes sense because the water doesn't have anywhere to go in the Dead Sea, right?
I said mud pits, tar pits.
Tar pits, yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay. The water doesn't have anywhere to go in the Dead Sea, so it goes straight there, and then it kind of ends. And you kind of wonder, if it had somewhere to go, why did this happen?
And if you think about it, tar traps water.
Mm-hmm.
This is just not coming to me, son, so this may be a blunder. But if it's full of tar pits, and God opens this area up, and we got this tar pit basin, if you will, it'd be the perfect place to trap water.
That's true. Yeah, so my theory is that Sodom and Gomorrah is the reason that this lake exists, but not the reason that it's salty. I think that's just a matter of the fact that the water doesn't have anywhere to go. And
so it's likely that the ruins of Sodom are at the bottom of this lake.
Probably. I mean, that makes sense, I guess. I don't know that there actually is anything to be found down there. I feel like probably we would have found something down there by now, but I'm not an archaeologist, so I don't know. Anyway, so back to the story.
Yes.
So God destroys the wicked. Genesis 19:23 through 26 says, "The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back." So
there she is.
"And she became a pillar of salt."
That's her right there. Well,
it's interesting that it says she becomes a pillar of salt because why salt? I don't know. But
she's encrusted in something.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, maybe she's like this petrified, like she gets caught in this volcano blast or something, and but why salt? I don't know.
I don't either.
Anyway, so she becomes this pillar of salt, again recognizing that God is destroying these wicked people, because the angels tell Lot and his wife and his daughters, don't look back, and Lot's wife does, and so she's punished, right? So she's destroyed for her wickedness, just like Sodom is.
And she looked back. How wicked is that? Well, it evidently is pretty wicked.
Yeah, I think kind of the idea isn't so much like she just kind of glances over his shoulder, because how do you not do that?
Right.
Like the whole town's exploding behind you, and you're expected to not.
It's like those heroes that come walking out of the explosion behind them, and they just come walking out like they don't even care that the fire is within 3 inches of their rear end.
Yeah.
How do you do that? You don't.
I think the idea is she's so distracted by what's behind her, wanting to be in Sodom,
Exactly,
that she gets somehow trapped in this these fire from heaven, this idea, whatever's going on here. I think that's the idea.
Yeah, and it contrasts with Lot. Lot's weeping over the condition of the city.
Mm-hmm.
She seems to be, but I was part of the inner circle. I was, a socialite. I would maybe, whatever. And I miss it. I wanted, that kind of. I think it's the heart that really ended up taking her.
Yeah, exactly. So you have kind of this application to that of we're going to end up in dark places, right? That's part of life. And yet we have to make sure we don't fall in love with those dark places.
Good point.
Because if we do, we end up like Lot's wife.
Good point.
The next thing, 19:27 through 28, "And Abraham went out early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord." So basically he goes out and he's checking on Sodom to see if it happened. "And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley. And he looked down, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace." That's the whole thing. I didn't realize.
Does Abraham, you think, know at this point that Lot made it?
I don't think so. It doesn't give any indication of whether or not he does, so I don't think he can really answer that question. But I think every indication is that Abraham is concerned about Lot, and he never finds out. He thinks Lot died in Sodom, and I think that's the implication. So it becomes this tragic story, right? That Abraham, he barters with God, he talks to God and says, "This is what I want to happen," and God even says yes, right? And yet it still doesn't happen the way that Abraham wants it to, because there aren't 10 righteous people to be found in Sodom.
So as far as we know, you correct me, but I think this is the last interaction we have between Abraham and Lot, and that's not even really much of an interaction. It's him looking down. The place is destroyed. I wonder what happened to my nephew. But is there something? I don't think there's another interaction between Abraham and Lot after this.
No, I don't. Not as far as I know. There's not. I guess I should have researched that.
But I was just kind of scanning here, because we get immediately into the various things about the birth of Isaac, etc. So I think we move on to other things. So who knows? Mm-hmm. But this might be one of those moments where God doesn't really give Abraham all the answers. Lot actually makes it, but maybe Abraham doesn't even know. And of course, when we find out about the daughters, I'm not sure Abraham wants to know.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that's something too, that whenever we look at these Bible stories, we tend to think like God is going in and he's interacting with people, and man, I wish he would interact with me in the same way. And I think a lot of times God didn't interact with these people as much as we think he did.
Good point.
Right?
Very good point.
It seems to be, every indication is that Abraham is promised that he's going to have a son. And then he has Ishmael. And he just assumes that Ishmael is the son that he's supposed to have for like 16 years. And then God comes and talks to Abraham and says, no, actually Isaac is the son that you're going to have.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's a pretty good explanation for why Abraham laughs. That we all kind of say, well, he's laughing out of joy. This isn't a faithless thing. That I think the idea is that Abraham's like, wait a second.
We had this all worked out.
Yeah, like Ishmael's the guy. Just take Ishmael. And so we've waited all this time, and I think that's how God deals with these people a lot. We think of it because every time there's a story, God interacts with them, but. There's years in between all these stories where
good point.
Nothing's
Very
happening.
Good point.
Nothing major is going on, and so God isn't interacting with them as much as I think we think he is. All right, so we're going to skim through this next part.
Okay.
So as you were pointing out, during the story, this part that we skipped here, Lot is with the angels, and they basically say to him, you need to flee out of the area, run to the hills, and Lot basically says no, right? He
I'm an
says,
old man, can't make it.
Yeah, and so he says, there's this town called Zoar, can I go to that town instead? And they say yes, and this is interesting because of this idea, righteousness by association, right? And so basically what we get from this story is we get this idea that God, yes, he rescues the righteous, he destroys the wicked, and yet he also rescues people that aren't necessarily righteous because they're associated with righteous people.
Yeah. I mean, the city that they're going to is evidently a city of the plains as well.
Yeah.
And we know how they get all blasted. But this one's going to how come this one gets protected?
Yeah, exactly. So the angel says, I think this is verse 22. I should have put it on there, but he says, "Behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing until you arrive there." So every implication of that statement is that he was fully intending to destroy the city, and he doesn't because Lot's going there.
Yeah, and I can do nothing until you get there.
Yeah,
he's holding back on behalf of people who are associated with the righteous.
Yeah, exactly. So Lot flees. Zoar this whole town is saved just because Lot's there. Lot's daughters are rescued, even though I think we can pretty clearly say that they're not particularly righteous. Maybe they are at this point, and they just get bad later on. But I can't.
You're a half full kind of guy.
I can't really say that with any level of confidence, right? And so, Lot's daughters are rescued because they're associated with Lot. You also have in chapter 18, whenever Abraham's dickering with God, you have this passage. So 18:26, and the Lord said, "If I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I'll spare the whole place for their sake."
Wow.
Right. So the deal essentially with God is, if you can find 10 righteous people, you're gonna spare the entire city. Right. You're not going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. This tragedy isn't going to happen because there's 10 righteous people there.
Yeah.
And it does happen because there's not 10 righteous people there. But you get this idea of righteousness by association, right? That these wicked people can be rescued because there's righteous people in their midst.
My favorite example of this, and you're going to have to give me all the details on this, but the guys in Dothan, I can't remember if it's Elijah or Elisha, but they're on top of the city wall. He's got his servant standing behind him. They're surrounded. Looks like the place is going to fall. But the prophet asks God, "Open my servant's eyes." And he's able to see what the prophet sees, which is the heavens are filled with the chariots of God. That was by association.
Yeah.
Because that young man, whoever he was by the prophet. He, by association, was able to see things that the normal person could not.
Yeah, exactly. I think most miracles probably fit into that category, right? And that obviously there's kind of this idea that you have to be faithful for these miracles to work, or something along those lines. And yet there is, I think, this idea that is not that you are this righteous person so much as it is you are having this miracle performed on you by somebody who is righteous, prophet, or most of the time Jesus.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The last, this might be the last verse I have, but Genesis 19:29 says, "So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived."
Powerful.
Yeah, so even though Lot is righteous, apparently, it says God remembers Abraham.
Yeah.
Right? And so Lot, even, it seems, is righteous by association. Kind of an honorable mention to this, I think, is whenever Lot's protecting the angels and they rescue him, they pull him inside, and so Lot is rescued from like this crowd of people that are trying to rape these guys.
Perverts.
Yes. Yeah, you could say that.
We've already given the disclaimer.
And so he's rescued from the men of Sodom because he's associated with the angels, right? Because they are in his house, they rescue him. And we have that same thing that happens with Jesus. Right?
Big finish.
That Jesus is righteous and we all are unrighteous. And just Jesus comes in and through his righteousness, he rescues us by our association with him.
Wow.
So the answer to this question of who is it that God saves the righteous, and he saves those who are associated with the righteous.
Yes.
He rescues us, he saves us, not because we're righteous people, but rather because becoming a Christian, being baptized, means becoming associated with Jesus and his righteousness.
Boy, that's good.
And that also means that we have a responsibility.
Yes.
Right? As righteous people, we have the responsibility of being Abraham to somebody, right? Going into these dark places and being these people that being the 10 righteous people in Sodom, that this place doesn't get destroyed or overthrown or whatever. These people get saved because we're there.
Yeah.
We're with them. And so we have the responsibility of going into dark places and yet not being Lot's wife, right? We go into dark places and yet we don't fall in love with dark places.
Responsibly going into dark places. Making sure that you stay by the master because he's the only one to keep you safe in that situation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think part of this goes back to what we talked about last week. I'll put up my questions while we talk about this. But part of this goes into what we talked about last week with the idea of wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, that's where I am. I think a lot of this idea comes down to you can't do it alone. Right? And so Lot is a righteous person, and yet I think he tries to do it by himself.
Yeah, he kind of isolated himself from his association with Abraham.
Yeah,
in a
exactly.
direct way.
And so he's rescued, and yet his family implodes. His wife dies. His daughters end up raping him. It's a terrible story. And I think that's because he doesn't bring other righteous people with him, right? Wow. And so we have this responsibility of doing both things.
That's a good point.
That we go into dark places. We ought to be the kinds of people that go to Sodom, and yet whenever we do that, we don't go by ourselves.
Don't go alone.
We don't go alone, exactly. We bring other righteous people with us, and hopefully we bring 10.
At least 10.
At least 10.
I was thinking about that. Noah gets 8.
Yeah.
He gets, 5?
Yeah, I guess. Well, the 2 angels, I guess, count. So,
okay.
So 5. But yeah, so bring 10 with you.
At least 10.
Yeah, so this is RestorationCast, where we have just finished our discussion of the Dead Sea.
Good stuff.
I don't plan on saying anything else that should be disclaimed.
Yeah, take your ears off the kids. We're going to be okay from here on.
Yeah, exactly. Next week we're going to be talking about Joseph. And
Joseph.
So I don't think we have anything too bad to say about Joseph.
Joseph, isn't he one of those characters that there just isn't anything really necessarily bad said about him?
Yeah, I think so.
So it's going to be a good transition. We'll go from Sodom let's talk about good stuff.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So next week we talk about Joseph. These are your 5 questions. If you're a Restoration School of Biblical Studies student, you can copy those down and answer them. And we'll talk to you next time.
God bless.